Alec's boots crunched against the rocky soil of LV for 31 as he stepped out of his survey vehicle. He tilted his head back and took in the alien sky, a black dome scattered with icy stars and the faint streak of a nearby nebula. The air was thin, but breathable, and carried the faint metallic tang of iron-rich soil. Another dead zone, came Paul's voice over the comm. He was perched on the other side of the ridge, his drone controller clutched in one hand while he scribbled notes on his tablet with the other. Nothing but rock and more rock. Alec sighed. Figures. Corporate's big money push on this rock probably fizzled years ago. If there was anything left to find, they would have found it by now. Paul chuckled dryly. Still getting paid to walk around and look busy. Not a bad gig. Alec scanned the ridge ahead. The jagged peaks cast long shadows in the planet's dim sunlight. He was about to respond when something caught his eye, an unnatural shimmer among the crags, like polished metal half buried in the dirt. "Hey, Paul," Alec said, his tone shifting. "Got something. Looks like..." "Yeah, definitely not rock." "What are you talking about?" Paul replied, his footsteps crunching closer. He joined Alec at the ridge, following the line of his gaze. Could be an old probe. Or part of a mining rig. Maybe. Alec adjusted his scanner and pointed it at the object. The readings came back faint, but distinct. It's giving off low-level energy. Definitely not inactive. Paul squinted and tilted his head. "You thinking salvage? Could be worth a look." Together, they carefully made their way down the slope. The object came into clearer view. A sleek, oval-shaped pod, partially covered by the planet's reddish dust. Its surface was a dull silver that reflected the light faintly, and it had the unmistakable signs of something not human-made. Alec's heart skipped a beat. Alien tech wasn't unheard of, but it was rare enough to turn a routine survey mission into something far more interesting. "All right," Paul muttered, leaning over the pod. "This isn't standard issue. Definitely not corporate. I don't even think it's union." "Let's not jump to conclusions," Alec said, though his gut told him otherwise. He reached for his toolkit and popped open a scanner. "I'll see if I can interface with it." Paul snorted. "You're the one who tells me not to touch weird alien stuff, and now you're first in line to poke at it? Call it professional curiosity." Alec shot back with a smirk. He knelt next to the pod and began attaching leads to the scanner. The surface was smooth, cool to the touch, and almost seemed to hum faintly beneath his fingertips. As he worked, Paul shifted from foot to foot. "What do you think it is? A ship? A probe? Could be a life pod," Alec said. "The shape matches some of the designs we've seen in the archives." "Hold on." He squinted at the screen. "There's a containment seal. No major breaches. So, there could be something inside." Alec nodded. "Only one way to find out." Paul made a face. "Yeah. Or we let the eggheads back at HQ deal with it. We're out here for a reason, Paul. Might as well do the job." Reluctantly, Paul stepped back as Alec initiated a cautious override. The panel on the side of the pod slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a dim interior lit by faintly glowing symbols that shifted and reformed like liquid script. Alec felt his breath catch. There, nestled inside the pod, was a figure. At first, he thought it was a statue, slender, angular, almost metallic. But as the light shifted, he saw the faint rise and fall of breathing. The figure's skin had an iridescent sheen, and its facial features were delicate and unfamiliar, with large, dark eyes that remained closed. Paul whispered, "No way. That's alive." "Looks like it," Alec said quietly. He reached for his medkit. "And if it is, we can't just leave them here." "You sure about this, man?" Paul sounded more nervous than skeptical now. "We don't know what it is. What if it's dangerous?" Alec glanced up at him, his expression firm. "Dangerous or not, it's in trouble. I'm not leaving it behind." As Alec moved to stabilize the figure, Paul sighed heavily and knelt down beside him. "All right, fine. But if we end up with alien parasites, I'm blaming you." "Noted." Alec managed a small grin before focusing on his work. Together, they carried the figure back to the vehicle. The alien stirred faintly as they moved it, murmuring soft sounds that neither of them could understand. For a moment, Alec thought he saw those dark eyes flicker open, just long enough to lock onto his. A chill ran down his spine. Not from fear, but from something deeper, something he couldn't quite put into words. They drove back to their camp in near silence, the pod now stowed securely. Paul kept casting nervous glances at their passenger, while Alec remained lost in thought. He didn't know what they'd stumbled upon out here in the middle of nowhere, but one thing was clear. The routine survey mission was over. Something bigger was beginning. Chapter 2, Awakening. The camp's floodlights hummed softly, illuminating the research station's cluttered interior. Alec and Paul laid their unexpected guest on a padded table, carefully unstrapping her from the makeshift stretcher. The alien girl was still unconscious, her shimmering skin catching the artificial light in odd, kaleidoscopic patterns. Paul crossed his arms and leaned against the console. Okay, we brought her here. Now what? Alec set down his medical scanner and glanced at the figure on the table. First, we make sure she's stable. We don't know how long she was in that pod or what condition she's in. Paul frowned. You're acting like this is a first aid drill. What if she wakes up and tries to tear our heads off? Then you can run and let me handle it, Alec said with a smirk, adjusting the scanner settings. For now, we need information. Scans, samples, anything that can tell us who or what she is. Paul groaned, rubbing the back of his neck. You know I signed up to fly drones and take soil samples, right? I didn't sign up to play nurse for a... A soft sound cut him off, a faint sigh that came from the table. Both men froze, their eyes darting to the alien girl. Her head shifted slightly, and her fingers curled against the surface of the table. Alec leaned in cautiously. Hey, it's okay, he said gently, unsure if she could understand him. You're safe. You're... Her eyes fluttered open, revealing large, dark orbs that seemed to absorb all the light around them. Alec caught his breath, startled by their intensity. The alien's gaze darted between Alec and Paul, her breathing quick and shallow. She muttered something, a series of sharp, musical syllables that neither man could understand. Paul took an involuntary step back. What's she saying? No idea, Alec said. He held up his hands slowly, trying to appear non-threatening. It's all right. We're not going to hurt you. Do you understand me? She blinked and tilted her head slightly, her expression a mix of wariness and confusion. Alec tapped his chest. Alec, my name is Alec. He pointed to Paul. This is Paul. Paul gave a half-hearted wave. Hi, Paul. That's me. The alien girl's gaze lingered on Alec, then shifted to Paul. Her lips moved again, forming words they couldn't decipher. But there was a soft, questioning tone to her voice. She's trying to communicate, Alec said, reaching for his datapad. He opened a language analysis program and held it up. Say it again, he urged, gesturing to the alien. Talk to this. The girl hesitated, then spoke another phrase, slower this time. The datapad software worked furiously, matching the sounds against known languages, but came up blank. Alec sighed. No direct match. Figures. This might take a while. Paul threw his hands up. Great. She's alive. She's talking. But we don't know what she's saying. Now what? We try something else, Alec said. He stepped back and retrieved a small container from the supply cabinet. Opening it, he held out a ration bar. Food? Do you need food? The alien's eyes flicked to the bar. She hesitated, then nodded faintly. Alec placed the bar on the table and slid it toward her. She examined it carefully before taking a small bite. Her reaction was subtle, a slight raise of her brow, as if she found it tolerable but unfamiliar. Paul watched in disbelief. Unbelievable. She's just sitting there eating like she's in a cafeteria. What did you expect? Alec said, smiling slightly. She's just a person, not so different. Paul muttered something under his breath and rubbed his temples. So what's the plan here, Alec? Teach her English? Have her sign a guest book? We can't just sit around playing language games. Alec set the datapad down and leaned against the console. The plan is to figure out what she needs, where she's from, and how to help her. You've got a better idea. Paul shrugged, clearly out of his depth. I don't know, man. I never thought we'd be doing something like this. Well, now we are, Alex said firmly. He turned back to the alien girl, who had finished the ration bar and was watching them carefully. Alec tapped his chest again. Alec. Then he pointed to her and raised his eyebrows. What's your name? She seemed to understand the gesture, pausing for a moment before saying a single, melodic word. Sayla. Alec smiled. Sayla. Okay, that's a start. Paul crossed his arms. All right, she's got a name. Now what? We keep going, Alec said. One step at a time. Chapter 3, Learning to Understand. The three of them sat in the research station's common area, dim light from the overhead panels casting long shadows. Alec leaned over the table, sketching rough diagrams on his datapad, while Paul alternated between nervously pacing and shooting skeptical glances at their alien guest. Sayla, seated opposite Alec, observed them both with a guarded expression. Her eyes followed every movement, studying their gestures and the unfamiliar devices spread across the table. Paul finally stopped pacing and threw up his hands. Okay, so what's the plan, genius? You're going to teach her English with a few scribbles and some hand-waving? Alec glanced up from his pad. It's not about teaching her English. It's about finding common ground. We have to start somewhere. Yeah, somewhere like handing her off to the first Union patrol that comes by. Paul shot back. Let them deal with it. Sayla tilted her head, clearly picking up on Paul's agitated tone. She said something in her melodic language, her words rising and falling in an unfamiliar rhythm. Alec gestured toward her and spoke slowly. Sayla, do you understand this? He tapped the drawing he'd made, a basic diagram of a sun and a planet in orbit. She leaned forward, her gaze flicking from Alec's finger to the sketch. After a moment, she nodded faintly, then pointed to the planet and said a word. Her tone suggested it was a name, perhaps the name of her homeworld. Alec looked up at Paul with a small, triumphant grin. See? She's starting to engage. This is how you build understanding. Paul snorted. Great. A galactic game of charades. What's next? Pictionary. Alec ignored him and turned back to Sayla. Sayla, he said again, pointing to his chest. Alec. Then he gestured toward Paul, who sighed and crossed his arms. Paul. She blinked once, then gave a faint smile, her first since waking. Paul, she said, her voice soft but clear. See, Alec said. Progress. Yeah, Paul muttered. A real breakthrough. Alec continued with simple gestures and words, pointing to objects around the room. Table, light, datapad, and waiting for Sayla to repeat them. She picked up on the patterns quickly, her sharp eyes tracking every movement. Paul eventually stopped pacing and joined them at the table, reluctantly chiming in when Alec gestured for his help. All right, Paul said, pointing to the datapad. This thing. What do you call it? Sayla stared at it, then murmured something that sounded close to Alec's earlier pronunciation of datapad. Paul raised an eyebrow. Ha! Not bad. Not bad at all, Alec said, glancing over at his partner. Maybe you could stop complaining for 5 minutes and actually help. Paul sighed and leaned forward. Fine. What else do you want me to do? Just interact with her, Alec said. She's picking up on gestures and tone. If we both keep it consistent, she'll catch on faster. Paul turned to Sayla and gave a half-hearted wave. Hey, Sayla. He tapped his own chest. Paul. She nodded. Paul. Yeah, that's me, he said, his tone softening. Paul. The three of them continued their makeshift language session, gradually building a tiny shared vocabulary. By the end of the hour, Sayla could repeat a dozen simple words and had started associating gestures with their meanings. Alec noticed that her posture had relaxed. She no longer clung to the edges of the chair as if ready to bolt at any moment. Paul, too, seemed more at ease, though he still kept his comments short and skeptical. When they finally paused for a break, Alec leaned back in his chair and stretched. Not bad for a day's work. We're starting to bridge the gap. Paul shrugged. Yeah, but what happens when we run out of simple words? We can't explain complex concepts with doodles and hand signals. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, Alex said. He turned to Sayla, giving her a warm smile. Good work today. Sayla tilted her head, then gave a small, tentative smile in return. Though it was fleeting, it spoke volumes. Alec had the sense that, for the first time since they found her, she was beginning to trust them. Paul caught the exchange and shook his head. Just don't expect me to play babysitter when she starts speaking fluently. Alec chuckled. Deal. But if she learns faster than you, I'm not letting you live it down. Sayla watched them with a quizzical look, as if trying to decode the banter. Alec tapped his datapad, preparing for their next session. Whatever obstacles lay ahead, he knew they were making progress. And as Sayla mimicked another word, her voice growing steadier with each attempt, Alec couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. They weren't just teaching her words, they were opening a door to understanding. Chapter 4: A Tentative Alliance. The sun rose on the alien horizon, casting long shadows over the rocky terrain. Inside the research station, Alec was bent over a portable console, examining the energy signature logs from Sayla's pod. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully, scrolling through wave patterns and heat traces that didn't match anything in the Union's standard database. Paul's voice broke his concentration. You've been staring at that screen for hours. Find anything useful? Alec didn't look up. Not yet. Her pod's tech is advanced. Way beyond our level, but I can't pin down its origin. There's no known manufacturer mark, no common alloys. It's like nothing we've seen before. Paul grabbed a chair and turned it around, sitting down backward. Great. So we're babysitting an alien princess and we don't even know what planet she's from. Sounds promising. She's not a princess, Alex said, half smiling. She's just someone who needs help. Yeah, well, maybe she can help us, Paul replied. He leaned back in his chair, balancing on two legs. We're out here with a stripped-down research station and a short supply run. We could use some alien tech magic. Alex shook his head. It's not that simple. We need to approach this carefully. Right? Carefully, Paul muttered. He tipped forward, letting the chair's legs hit the floor. So what's the plan? We can't keep her locked up in here forever. Before Alec could respond, the station's inner door slid open with a hiss. Both men turned to see Sayla standing in the doorway. She looked hesitant, her eyes darting between them. She had adjusted quickly to the station's environment, but this was the first time she'd ventured out of the small bunk area on her own. Paul raised an eyebrow. Looks like she's already making herself at home. Alex stood and gestured toward a chair. Sayla, come sit. She stepped inside slowly, her movements fluid and deliberate. Her gaze lingered on the console screen, then shifted to Alec. He repeated the gesture, and she finally took a seat. Paul watched with guarded curiosity. Alec opened his datapad and brought up a few basic diagrams of planetary systems. Sayla, he began, pointing to the images. Do you recognize any of these? Sayla studied the screen. Her brow furrowed as she scanned the diagrams. After a moment, she reached out and tapped one of the systems. High layer, she said softly. Alec exchanged a glance with Paul. High layer, is that your home? Sayla nodded faintly, then said something in her own language. The words were melodic, almost like a song, but their meaning was lost on Alec and Paul. Paul leaned forward. Is she saying she's from there? Or she wants to go there? I think she's saying it's her home, Alec replied. He turned to Sayla. You lived on High Layer? He pointed to the image and then gestured toward her. Sayla hesitated, then gave another slow nod. High Layer. Paul rubbed his temples. Well, great. High Layer. Not exactly a name that shows up on any star maps I've seen. How far away is it? Alec tried to simplify his question. How long to get there? Distance. He made a motion with his hands, mimicking a long journey. Sayla looked thoughtful, then raised 3 fingers. High layer 3. 3 what? Paul asked. Years? Months? Days? Paul, Alex said. We're lucky she even understands numbers. Let's not overwhelm her. Paul threw his hands up. I'm just saying, if she's from a planet that's 3 galaxies over, we're going to need a better plan. Alec turned back to Sayla. Okay. High layer. 3. He smiled gently, trying to encourage her. That's a start. She watched him carefully, her dark eyes flickering with an emotion he couldn't quite place. There was a moment of quiet as they all sat there, unsure of what to say next. Finally, Paul broke the silence. So what now? We can't just hop in a ship and fly her to some unknown system. Even if we had the coordinates, we're not equipped for a trip like that. We don't have to decide everything right now, Alex said. The first step is understanding her and her situation. The rest will come later. Paul sighed. Yeah, sure. Let's just take it one incomprehensible alien word at a time. Alec grinned. Now you're getting the hang of it. Sayla watched them exchange words, her head tilting slightly, as if she were trying to follow their conversation. When Alec met her gaze, she offered a tentative smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him believe they were headed in the right direction. Chapter 5. Trust in the Unknown. The research station was silent, save for the faint hum of the atmospheric processors. Alec crouched near the console, carefully calibrating the energy scanner to match the readings from Sayla's pod. Paul stood behind him, arms crossed, watching with a mix of curiosity and impatience. How long is this going to take? Paul asked, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. We've been sitting on our hands for hours. Alec didn't look up. These readings don't make sense. I need to figure out why. If we can understand how her pod works, maybe we'll know more about how to help her. Paul sighed. I get that, but she's been cooped up in here for days. She must be going. Me to do? Alec asked, his tone more curious than defensive. I don't know. Maybe show her around? Get her to trust us more. Right now, she's just watching us like we're another experiment. Before Alec could reply, the inner door hissed open, and Sayla stepped into the room. Her movements were measured, her gaze flicking between the two men. She carried one of the translation tablets Alec had given her earlier, its screen glowing faintly. Speak, she said, her voice hesitant but clear. Paul raised an eyebrow. She's talking now? Alec smiled. She's trying. That's good progress. Sayla held up the tablet, showing a simple phrase written in halting English. Show outside. Paul gave Alec a pointed look. See? Even she wants out. Alec approached Sayla slowly, nodding at the tablet. Outside? You mean, out of the station? Sayla nodded. Outside. See? Paul smirked. Guess that settles it. Field trip time. Alec turned to his partner. All right, but we stay close. I don't want to risk anything. Yeah. Paul muttered, grabbing his jacket. Let's show her the grand tour. The air outside the station was crisp and faintly metallic, carrying the scent of iron-rich soil and distant storms. Sayla stepped out cautiously, her head tilting upward to take in the sky. The twin suns cast long shadows across the jagged terrain, and the faint shimmer of the nebula painted the horizon in soft blues and greens. Paul walked ahead, pointing at the landscape. That's the ridge we came over when we found your pod, he said, motioning toward the distant peaks. And over there, that's where we set up the first scanner array. Sayla's gaze followed his gestures, her expression thoughtful. She didn't say much, but she was clearly absorbing every detail. Alec walked alongside her, occasionally glancing at her face to gauge her reaction. Beautiful, isn't it? Alec said, pointing at the nebula. Sayla nodded slowly. Beautiful, she repeated. Paul chuckled. There you go. She's already picking up your poetic side. Alec shot him a look, but Paul just grinned. They walked further, eventually reaching a small plateau that offered a clear view of the surrounding valleys. Alec spread his arms, gesturing to the open expanse. This is where we've been working. Not much out here, but it's peaceful. Sayla looked out at the landscape, her large, dark eyes reflecting the light. For a moment, she seemed lost in thought. Then she turned to Alec and pointed toward a patch of land near the horizon. High layer? She asked. Alec shook his head. No, high layer is far from here. She frowned, then looked back at the ground. Paul, who had been leaning against a nearby rock, stepped forward. You've been saying that name a lot. Is it your home? Selah hesitated before nodding. High layer. Home. Paul glanced at Alec. We should probably start figuring out how to get her back there. She's not going to be happy stuck here forever. I know, Alec said. But we can't just send her off without knowing more. We need coordinates, more information about her ship systems. It's not simple. Paul sighed. Nothing ever is. Selah watched their exchange, her brow furrowing as if trying to understand their words. Then she stepped closer to Alec and placed a hand lightly on his arm. Help? She said, her voice quiet but firm. Alec met her gaze, surprised by the directness of her gesture. We will, he said, his tone soft. We'll help you. I promise. Paul muttered under his breath. We'd better figure out how, sooner rather than later. Alec nodded, his attention still on Selah. For the first time since they'd met, her expression held something other than fear or confusion. There was a flicker of something new, an unspoken understanding between them. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Alec knew they'd face them together. Chapter 6. Bridging the Gap. The dim glow of the station's interior lights barely reached the far corner where Alec sat, adjusting one of the data modules connected to his makeshift communications relay. The soft hum of the equipment filled the room as Paul walked in, holding 2 steaming mugs of what passed for coffee on this desolate world. Here, Paul said, handing Alec a mug. Thought you might need a break before you fry that thing. Alec looked up and accepted the mug with a small grin. Thanks. Just trying to patch into the old network satellites. If I can get a signal, we might find more about her world. Paul plopped down into a chair across from him, sipping his coffee. Good luck. Those satellites have been up there for decades. Half of them are probably space junk by now. Worth a shot, Alec replied, taking a sip of the bitter liquid. He set the mug aside and turned back to his equipment. What's Selah up to? Paul leaned back, his chair creaking. Still in her room. She's been tinkering with that translator pad you gave her. Alec arched an eyebrow. Tinkering? Yeah, like I saw her taking it apart. Thought she was breaking it, but then she put it back together. Looks like she made it work faster. Alec blinked. She improved the translator? Looks that way, Paul said. She's no slouch. We might need to step up our game. As if on cue, the door to the living quarters opened, and Selah walked in, holding the now slightly modified translator pad. Her large eyes scanned the room, then settled on Alec and Paul. She held up the device. Better, she said in a measured tone, her words clear and precise. Paul whistled. Well, I'll be. She's picking up more than just words. Alec stood and approached her, taking the pad and examining it. What did you do? Selah tapped the screen and then gestured toward the back panel. Fast. Learn more. She optimized it, Alec muttered half to himself. He handed it back to her. You're full of surprises, aren't you? Selah tilted her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Learn fast. Paul laughed. Yeah, no kidding. So what's the next step, Alec? Are we teaching her calculus now? Maybe, Alec said, half joking. But first, we need to find out more about her ship and her homeworld. If we can fix her pod or at least get a signal out, we'll have options. Selah frowned, then pointed at the equipment on the console. Ship? Alec nodded. Your ship. Your pod. We're trying to learn how it works. She stepped closer to the console, watching the data scroll across the screen. After a moment, she reached out, pointing to a set of symbols. Here, she said. High layer. Alec and Paul exchanged glances. You recognize these? Alec asked. Selah nodded. Yes, high layer. Paul scratched his head. So what does that mean? That these symbols are coordinates. Could be, Alec said, frowning in thought. If these readings are tied to her ship's navigation systems, they might tell us where high layer is. Sayla's gaze shifted between the two men, then back to the screen. She tapped the console again, scrolling to another section. Fix, she said. Work together. Paul smirked. Now she's giving us orders. Great. Alec shot him a look but smiled faintly. She's not wrong. We do need to work together. For the next few hours, the three of them pored over the readings. Sayla demonstrated a knack for identifying which symbols corresponded to navigation data and which ones were related to the pod's power systems. Alec marveled at her quick understanding, while Paul grumbled but ultimately followed her lead. As the night wore on, they made real progress. They pinpointed a string of data that appeared to be a coordinate set and another that seemed to describe the type of fuel the pod used. Sayla confirmed each step with short, halting phrases, her English improving with every exchange. Paul finally stretched and let out a low whistle. I'll be honest, I didn't think we'd get this far. She's good. Alec nodded, glancing at Sayla. You're right. She is. Sayla looked between them, her gaze steady. Work together, she repeated softly, then added, friends. Paul raised an eyebrow. Did she just call us friends? Alec smiled. I think she did. Well, I'll be damned, Paul said, shaking his head. Never thought I'd be buddies with an alien. Sayla tilted her head, a faint smile playing at her lips. Buddies. Paul laughed. See? She's catching on fast. Alec chuckled. Yeah, she is. As the console hummed softly in the background, Alec couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. They weren't just making progress with the data, they were building something deeper. The gap between them and Sayla was starting to close, one word and one shared task at a time. Chapter 7. A Fragile Understanding. The room was quiet except for the steady rhythm of Alec typing on his console. The translation matrix was improving, thanks in part to Sayla's adjustments. She sat nearby, her head tilted in concentration as she examined a series of navigation readings. Paul was on the other side of the room, inspecting a piece of the pod's exterior plating they had brought in to study. This alloy, Paul muttered, holding it up to the light. It's like nothing I've seen before. Doesn't match any known samples in the Union's database. Alec glanced up from his console. We knew her ship was advanced. This just confirms it. Advanced isn't the word, Paul said. This stuff makes our tech look ancient. And yet, here we are, trying to fix it with duct tape and ingenuity. Sayla looked up from the console and said, Good tape. Fix. Paul laughed. I think she's got a sense of humor. Alec grinned. Either that or she really trusts our patchwork repairs. Sayla glanced between the two men, her expression serious. Work together. Fix ship. Go home. Alec's smile faded slightly. That's the plan. We're working on it. Still don't get how we're supposed to power it up, Paul said, placing the alloy piece down. We don't have anything close to the kind of energy source her pod needs. We'll figure something out, Alec replied, returning his attention to the console. Sayla stood and walked over to the table where the alloy piece lay. She picked it up and examined it closely, her slender fingers tracing the intricate patterns on its surface. After a moment, she tapped a point near the edge and turned to Alec. Here. Power. Alec frowned. Power source is inside? Sayla nodded. Yes. Small generator. Paul groaned. So what? We have to take apart the pod's shell to get at it. Sayla shook her head. No. Open panel. Not hard. Well, Alec said, standing. If it's as simple as opening a panel, we should check it out. Your idea of simple and mine are usually miles apart, Paul muttered. But he grabbed his toolkit and followed them to the storage bay where they had placed the pod. The pod sat under a set of overhead lights, its sleek surface gleaming. Sayla walked around to the side and pointed at a narrow seam. Here. Alec crouched down, running his hand along the seam. I see it. Looks like it needs a specific tool to open. Paul pulled a small multi-tool from his pocket. Maybe this'll do the trick. Sayla watched intently as Paul worked the tool into the seam. After a few tries, there was a soft click, and a small panel slid open, revealing a compact device covered in glowing, unfamiliar symbols. Paul let out a low whistle. That doesn't look like any generator I've ever seen. Alec leaned in, studying the intricate structure. It's tiny. Could be a 0-point energy source or something even more advanced. 0-point, huh? Paul said, shaking his head. No way we're building one of these in the back of the station. Sayla touched the panel lightly, then pointed at a cluster of symbols. Power. Enough to fix ship. Go. Paul crossed his arms. Okay, let's say we can tap into this power. How do we repair the rest of the pod? It's still damaged from the crash. Alec thought for a moment. We don't need to make it perfect. Just enough to get her back to her people. Once she's home, they can do the full repairs. Sayla looked at Alec, her large eyes reflecting the soft glow of the generator. You help. Alec met her gaze. We'll help, but you'll need to guide us. Sayla nodded, a small smile appearing. Guide. Work together. Paul sighed, running a hand through his hair. You two make it sound so easy. All right, I'm in. Let's figure out how to rig this thing back together. The three of them spent the next few hours mapping out the pod systems. Alec translated Sayla's gestures and words into actionable steps, while Paul handled the physical repairs. As they worked, Sayla began using more English words, her sentences becoming more fluid. She corrected their guesses about the pod systems with a sharp clarity that impressed them both. Eventually, they hit a snag when a critical component turned out to be cracked. Paul threw down his tool in frustration. Great, now what? We can't exactly replace that with parts from our toolkit. Alec frowned, deep in thought. Maybe we can reinforce it. Create a temporary patch until she gets home. Sure, why not? Paul muttered. Duct tape fixes everything, right? Sayla tilted her head. Duct tape? It's a joke, Alec explained, smiling. A human way of saying we'll improvise. Sayla nodded slowly. Improvise. Good. Despite the setbacks, they continued working, their movements becoming more synchronized. Paul's skepticism softened as he watched Sayla's quick thinking and problem-solving. Alec couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unity among the three of them, despite their vast differences. As they finished the session, Paul leaned back against a nearby console, wiping his forehead. All right, we've got a plan. What's next? Alec glanced at Sayla, who stood quietly, studying the repaired component. Next, Alec said, we keep going, step by step. Paul shook his head with a wry smile. Yeah, step by step. Sure. Sayla looked at them both and repeated the phrase, her voice steady. Step by step. Alec smiled. Exactly. Chapter 8. A New Horizon. The repair work was complete, at least as complete as it could be under their limited conditions. The small generator hummed softly, its glow steady, as Sayla ran her hands over the control panel. Paul stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching the alien girl as if she were about to launch a starship from their humble storage bay. All right, Paul said, breaking the silence. We've patched it up, powered it up, and crossed our fingers. What now? Sayla turned to Alec, her large eyes calm but intent. Home. High layer. Alec nodded, then glanced at Paul. This is it. We've done everything we can. Now we see if it works. Paul sighed and leaned against a nearby crate. And if it doesn't? We'll cross that bridge if we come to it, Alec replied. Sayla looked at them both, her expression hard to read. Thank you, she said, her English hesitant but clear. Help, friend. Paul snorted. Friend. Huh? I guess I'll take it. Alec smiled. We couldn't just leave you stranded. Sayla stepped closer to Alec, her head tilting slightly. You kind. Not like before. Alec blinked. What do you mean? Before? Sayla said, her voice quiet. Others. Not kind. Paul frowned. You mean your people? They're not nice to each other. Sayla hesitated, then nodded. No kind. No help. Well, Alec said softly, I guess you're learning that not everyone is like that. We humans, we help each other. We try, anyway. Sayla studied his face, her gaze lingering. She stepped even closer, and for a moment, Alec felt an unexpected warmth in her presence. It wasn't just the gratitude. There was something deeper in her expression, a connection they had built over these days of shared effort. Paul cleared his throat loudly. Right? So, what's the plan now? Sayla stepped back slightly and turned toward the pod. She gestured to the console. Now, I go. Alec nodded, his voice steady. If the pod holds together, it'll get you to high layer. And if it doesn't? Paul asked, his tone skeptical. Sayla glanced at Paul. Try. Guess that's all we can do? Paul muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. The three of them worked together to make final checks. Alec reviewed the makeshift wiring and data connections. Paul tightened the reinforced plating, and Sayla monitored the pod's internal readings. There were a few tense moments when one of the systems didn't respond, but Sayla's quick adjustments and Alec's improvised solutions got them through. Finally, everything seemed stable. The pod emitted a soft, steady hum, and the navigation console displayed a clear route to high layers coordinates. Sayla turned to Alec and Paul. Now ready. Paul leaned against the wall and crossed his arms. Well, I guess this is it. Never thought I'd actually say goodbye to an alien buddy. Sayla tilted her head, her expression curious. Buddy? Paul grinned. Yeah, buddy. Friend. Sayla nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. Buddy. Alec stepped forward, his voice quieter. Take care of yourself, Sayla. I hope you find what you're looking for back home. Sayla studied him for a moment, then said, You kind. I not forget. Alec felt a lump form in his throat. He extended his hand, and after a brief hesitation, Sayla reached out and clasped it. Her hand was cool and smooth, but her grip was firm, conveying a sense of finality. Paul watched the exchange, then rolled his eyes. All right, enough with the heartfelt goodbyes. Let's get this show on the road before something breaks again. Sayla gave him a small, amused look, then stepped into the pod. She moved with calm determination, her every motion deliberate. The door slid closed behind her, and the lights inside the pod brightened. Alec and Paul stood back as the pod systems powered up. The steady hum grew louder, and the air around it seemed to shimmer faintly. Sayla's face was visible through a small window, her expression calm but focused. She raised a hand in a silent farewell. Alec raised his hand in return. Paul gave a quick wave, muttering, Good luck out there, buddy. The pod began to lift off the floor, its thrusters emitting a soft, blue glow. It hovered for a moment, then shot upward, disappearing into the sky. A faint streak of light trailed behind it, then faded into the atmosphere. The station fell silent once more. Alec and Paul stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty spot where the pod had been. Well, Paul said eventually, that was different. Alec smiled faintly. Yeah, it was. Paul clapped a hand on his shoulder. Come on, man. Let's clean up this mess. We've got work to do. Alec nodded, turning back toward the station. As they walked inside, he couldn't help but glance back at the sky one last time. Somewhere out there, Sayla was on her way home, and though they might never see her again, Alec knew their paths had changed each other in ways that couldn't be undone.